This night we continue a wonderful summer tradition here at Beth Am of learning from our members. And each week during the summer, a different one of our members will offer a Devar Torah. And on this night, it's a pleasure to invite forward Emily Nagaonkar, who has been part of our community since 2013 and a member of our board for the past 2 years. Hi, how are you? Good to see you here. It's pretty windy.
Good evening. In addition to what Rabbi Morrison shared, is this better? I am one of the facilitators of the Facing Our Truths workshop. And through a Jewish lens, this workshop explores race, privilege, power, and the biases that we all hold. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. I was raised in a liberal, white Jewish family in the 80s and 90s. We lived in the Metro Detroit suburbs that boasted racial and ethnic diversity, albeit in an upper middle class setting. Among other seemingly progressive notions, I was taught that the color of a person's skin doesn't matter. The idea behind this is that everyone was equal and that race was a non-issue. In school, we learned pervasive messages that America was the great melting pot. This was said with enthusiasm and not taking into consideration the unique qualities and distinctiveness of each culture and subculture. We certainly didn't grapple with structural racism, all of the ways in which people of color experience racism on a daily basis, the impact on their lives and communities, and the immensity of violence against people of color. I then went to college at the University of Wisconsin and took a class in the African American Studies department. We read the piece, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. The author, Peggy McIntosh, shares that she had been taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance. She demonstrates in her writing that this is not the case. McIntosh took this enormous, heavy phrase, white privilege, and made it tangible to me. She lists numerous instances where her white skin gives her inherent privilege. Perhaps unsurprisingly, all 26 circumstances listed were a yes for me. To name just a few. I can go into a music shop and count on finding the music of my race represented, into a hairdresser's shop and find someone who can cut my hair. I'm never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work against me. This piece was written in 1989, and while some of the markers have moved, we have a long way to go. The racism, widespread structural inequalities, and interpersonal violence permeate our society. Almost 2 decades ago, reading and discussing this piece felt incredibly uncomfortable. I can't say that I took actions or great strides to right these wrongs. I don't know that I had the tools, and I certainly didn't have the informal community. All of my friends at the time were white, and my close friends from childhood were white and Jewish. So I read the piece, I discussed it inside and out of the classroom, and then I put it to the side, because as a white person, it was something I could choose to put aside. Much more recently, I read the book, So You Want to Talk About Race. The author, Ijeoma Oluo, writes, being privileged doesn't mean that you are always wrong and that people without privilege are always right. It means that there is a good chance you are missing a few very important pieces of the puzzle. It's not all or nothing. This is complex and draining, and when it gets to be too much, I have the privilege to put down the book, close my laptop, and pause the conversation. For the almost 50 million Black Americans, they don't have this luxury. And that doesn't mean that I should beat myself up about it, but that I must be cognizant of what is happening in communities across America and what actions must be taken in order for change to occur. About 6 years ago, I fell in love with a man with darker skin who came from a different country. Just by living with Harsh, he opened my eyes to the world that he lives in. There have been numerous situations that we experience completely differently simply due to our race and color of our skin. He gets questions asked of him that I've never received. He thinks about, proactively plans for, and responds to interactions that I never think about. In my social settings, places of employment, and in my religious community, I've never given a second thought to my race or ethnicity. This is just not true for him. I was already active in Beth Am, and in 2016, we started participating in the community as a couple. We got involved in the young adult programming, now the Orchard. We were married by Rabbi Sarah in an interfaith, intercultural ceremony. In 2020, Beth Am developed the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative, and we were invited to participate. I joined in an early meeting where multiple Beth Am members shared their personal stories at Beth Am that involved race. There were instances of being othered on all levels. And while some of these interactions may have been well-intentioned, the reality was that hurtful comments were being directed at Beth Am members. This was the first time for me that Judaism and racism was discussed in the same space. Beth Am has been at the forefront for intermarriage, LGBTQ inclusiveness, and big tent practices. However, when we're talking about race, this is an area we can improve upon within the Jewish community and outside of it. While Beth Am and the Jewish world is acknowledging areas of growth, what I do find troubling is when this is posited as a zero-sum game. The assumption is that if we focus on issues of race, it will lessen other inequalities and instances of violence, such as anti-Semitism. As Jews, we know what it feels like to be othered and to be victims of violence and persecution. To me, issues of race are intrinsically linked to Judaism. I grew up in a conservative Ashkenazi synagogue. I don't remember seeing any congregants who weren't white. Early in my Jewish education, I remember learning about the writing from a German Lutheran pastor in 1946 about the silence of Germans. Many people have seen the quote that is displayed in the Holocaust Memorial Center. And then they came for me. The premise is that people and groups that hold privilege, that are safe, must speak up and take action for those who do not. Most of us have that privilege. I don't believe any of what I am saying is political. Part of my upbringing was the verse from the book of Deuteronomy, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof, which translates to, justice, justice, you shall pursue. Judaism, and the Reform movement in particular, is built upon social justice. This is what draws me and has connected my husband to Judaism. These are fundamental human rights issues. In the book I mentioned earlier, So You Want to Talk About Race, she notes, our humanity is worth a little discomfort. It's actually worth a lot of discomfort. Refusing to have a dialogue about race will not resolve these issues. It will only perpetuate them and allow them to fester. How can we be advocates, anti-racists, and create any meaningful change when we can't talk about it? We must acknowledge the blatant and unknowing ways we have contributed, and we must feel uncomfortable. Professionally, I'm a social worker, and when facilitating a support group one time, I reflected on how often we use the word but. When we have feelings of guilt, shame, or when we say something out loud that is uncomfortable, we pit those emotions or realities against each other. The group I was leading was not about race, but I've found it a useful tool when reframing my thoughts. So I encourage folks to replace the word but with and. Both things can be true. We can take strides and participate in causes for racial equality and recognize that we have benefited from many structures in our society. We can acknowledge this is critical work and have other commitments and keepers of our time and energy. We can do everything in our daily lives to be anti-racist and still live with privilege if we have white skin. We can commit to taking action against racism on an individual, community, and macro level while also fighting other injustices. We can read the books, attend the lectures, join in the discussions, and acknowledge that we have so much to learn. I don't know what my children will look like or how they will experience the world they live in. I do know we have increasingly diverse Jewish communities. I greatly appreciate the commitment the Jewish synagogues and organizations are making to bring these issues to light. We must spend the time, energy, and resources and do deep work to truly make a difference. I look forward to continuing this journey along with my Beth Am community. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.